All right. So if we could make our way back into the auditorium, we can get started with our second panel for the day. So my name is Jamelia Morgan. I'm a professor of law here at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and it's my distinct honor to welcome you all to our law school for the Accessible Public Safety Conference. I'm really delighted to be partnering with Access Living and extremely grateful to Chris Huff for his vision in this particular event and for seeing it through to fruition. Also grateful for the Lawndale Christian Legal Center for their support as well. So it takes a lot to put an event together like this. So I just want to take a few moments to thank our incredible new executive director here at the Center for Racial and Disability Justice, Jordan Jensen, for Jordan's incredible work in putting this together. Jordan has handled a lot of the logistics and worked alongside our Northwestern team to get things done. So if you see her today, please thank her. I also want to thank Sebastian, our fearless events coordinator here at Northwestern School of Law, for his incredible assistance. Matt and the AV, our incredible AV crew, our ASL interpreters. It takes quite a bit to put an event on this scale together. So I want to thank them all for their time and energies. And please keep us accountable if there's things that we can do to make this event more accommodating. Please let us know, including altering the AC, and that's been done. Just a quick image description. I'm a Black woman, hair's in braids. I'm wearing a purple shirt to show school spirit for Northwestern, and Black pants and a Black sweater. I'm going to be our moderator for the event today. We are, or at least our panel today. The second panel is discussing data collection and recidivism reduction. We're going to be thinking through some important insights related to key considerations on the relevance of data collection and its role in helping to shape the delivery of disability supports and services, in particular for impacted people of color. With a particular focus on data as it relates to recidivism and mass incarceration. So I'm going to be joined in conversation with incredible panelists who've been doing this work and thinking this through for a number of years. I'm joined by Eric Vasquez, Access Living Advisory Board Council member, who will be joining us remotely. Cliff Nellis, Executive Director of Lawndale Christian Legal Center, and Amber Smock, Access Living Policy Director, I believe. So one of the things that I do want to request of all of our panelists is that they do an image description before speaking, and also that when they speak, they briefly say, this is your name, so that it helps our captioning for the event. And I will try to model that by way of reminders. So I'm going to ask a few questions of our panelists. We're going to try to have a conversation, but I do also want to encourage you all here in the audience and online to ask us questions. And so I'll try to save about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end. We'll go till about 11:45, thereabouts, so that everyone can ask questions and we can have a conversation and pick up where we left off after the first incredible panel. All right. So if everyone could start with just telling us a little bit about themselves, the work that you do in particular, and if we could also start with our first question. So, what are the gaps in data when we think about public safety and people with disabilities? What are the gaps in data relating to that particular intersection? I know it's a broad one, but please respond with your sort of experience and the vantage point of the work that you're doing. Let's get started with Amber, then we can go to Eric, and then Cliff. Take it away, Amber.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amber Smock, and I am the Director of Advocacy for Access Living. My image description is that I'm a white woman with short, blondish brown hair and a white sweater and pink dress today. I just want to thank everyone for allowing me to join in this panel today because I think people might think that data is not a particularly sexy discussion, but believe it or not, there are definitely some things to say. As the director of advocacy, that means I supervise the policy and community organizing that we do for disability community stuff at Access Living. And I want to be very clear when I say the staff do a lot of different things. So my staff cover housing, transportation, education, immigration, alternatives to police response, racial justice issues, and on and on and on. So we cover a very wide array of issue areas, and we work in close collaboration with Access Living Civil Rights Department, our legal department, as well as communication and our direct services. So the nice thing about being an advocate at Access Living is we have access to a lot of different pathways to fight for change. And something important that you should know about me for this discussion is that I did not start at Access Living as a policy person. My first job at Access Living was as the youth organizer for Access Living. So I would go to different schools around the Chicago Public Schools and look for young people with disabilities who had a certain sense of fire and ask them to come to Access Living, and we would learn how to do community organizing together. So the work that I do is very much focused on making sure that policy discussions are led by and with people with disabilities, the most impacted communities, depending on what the subject matter is and so forth. We have been lucky to be able to work in the area, like very directly in the area of diversion, reentry, and incarceration since about 2018. So compared to some organizations, it's a bit newer for us. But I can tell you that when we got started with this work, we were appalled at the status of disability data collection related to diversion, incarceration, and reentry for people with disabilities, regardless of race. Appalled. When we ask for an accurate count of how many people with disabilities are in a given group, the gold standard for us is for people to be able to self-identify. But we learned that the last time the Bureau of Prisons really conducted a study to find out how many disabled incarcerated people there were, it was the Bureau of Justice Statistics, I think it was like 2011. Mm-hmm. So it's been at least 12 years since the federal government asked people in prisons across the country if they identified as a person with a disability. The other thing that I want to say is an important gap is that disability is a very multifaceted, it's a multifaceted personal experience, but it is also a deeply fragmented issue in terms of looking at data, because there are many different definitions of disability. There is the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability, which is, you experience barriers to major life activities. There is a Social Security disability definition, which is, are you fit enough to work? Now, there are disability definitions that are not necessarily disability definitions, but I would say, what's your medical diagnosis? Okay. There are also lots of people who don't identify, haven't been able to get a diagnosis of any kind due to their life circumstances, which is a lot of the people we're talking about today. And so trying to get an aggregate sense of the disabled people in this group is a mess. And as a community organizer, I always ask, well, who has the power over this? And you know who has the power over disability statistics in the United States? The chief statistician of the United States. There is an office in the White House called the Office of Management and Budget. And under them, there's this woman named Karen, Karin, who is the chief statistics person for the United States. It turns out the bureau that she oversees doesn't have any particular directive to collect disability information. Maybe we can change that. But as I said, it's complicated. I'll pass it over to the next panelist.
Mm-hmm. This is Jamelia. Eric, maybe you can pick up next.
Hi, this is Eric. I am a Hispanic male fault, and I am wearing a black T-shirt and black jeans. Um, where Amber, what Amber was saying, well, let me start where my background. I started with Access Living because I did that webinar on people who were incarcerated with disabilities, and I guess that's where Amber saw me and asked me to just come along on this, and I willingly did it because this is something that I've been wanting to do since I was incarcerated almost 2 decades ago. But yeah, the incarcerated. I mean, we do need a lot of data on this because unfortunately, like she's saying, we don't have the resources for it, and we obviously she's just stated that we don't have any means or even laws in practice for them to even collect it. And we do, like, listening to all the panelists before me. I mean, they were touching on so many subjects as far as racism and incarceration with being the needs met in there. I think it needs to start there because a lot of like from my personal experience, a lot of my chief complaints that come from that, being disabled and being in the system and the way they treated you, was it just comes back to lack of empathy, like they were saying, lack of understanding. And even if a lot of them are harboring hate deep down inside, and they are racist, and they're not, they're not outwardly, but their actions show it. um Kill them with kindness. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, that's what's working with me in the future. Even, eventually that hate will break down when they start to, like they said, view us other than an animal, or something that isn't human to them, because that's the way they were raised, or indoctrinized. Who knows why they feel the way they do. um but I mean, I wish I knew where to begin to reach out to these lawmakers to be able to do this. But that's why I'm here, so I can, maybe somehow all of us together as a collective, we'll make it happen.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you, Eric. This is Jamelia again. Cliff, why don't you go next?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, great. Well, first, I just want to apologize. I wish I could be there with you in person. My two boys have turned out to be pretty good soccer players, and so we're traveling for some soccer games today. And my daughter has her annual dance recital as well, so it just couldn't make it work. So I'm actually, as far as a description, I am not starting with how I look, but where I am in my car next to soccer fields where my boys are playing. As far as who I am a white male, bald. I'm wearing a black Lawndale Christian Legal Center shirt and black shorts. As far as what do I do, 14 years ago, started a legal center on the west side called the Lawndale Christian Legal Center. We have specialized in representing young people involved in the criminal justice system at any step of that system, from policing all the way to parole. So there's a lot of that in between, but our primary, our sweet spot, I suppose, would be holistic community-based criminal defense. So we provide full legal representation through trial, pro bono for young people in juvenile court, and then emerging adults in adult court. When it comes to the conversation about data and recidivism, I won't repeat anything that's been said, but I will say that it's essential for multiple reasons. I think one, for us to just run our organization well and understand the young people we serve and what their needs are. If we're not creating processes internally for data and then analyzing it and understanding what the need is and how to meet that need for fundraising and resources and the like, then we wouldn't be able to know what the need is, and then we wouldn't be able to address it. But I'll point to just I think I'm going to focus mostly on the criminal justice system and the really deplorable lack of data and analysis and structures and infrastructure that's in place in almost every area of that system, meaning police, public defender's office, judiciary, state's attorney, probation, parole, prison. I mean, it's not exactly a system that's known for data transparency and rigorous analysis. But when Eric and Amber were speaking, I just thought of a time. I was just down in Springfield. The budget was passed, so I was in Springfield in May. And I was talking to one of the legislators, not related to why I was down there, but he was telling me that one of the bills he passed was having, and I don't, it was a kind of quick conversation, so I might not get this all right, but I got the idea. It was making sure that when people could check what their race and ethnicity is on population forms, that you could now check Middle Eastern. Before it was like Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and other. And he explained to me that without that data, Middle Eastern contractors wouldn't qualify as minority business owners and therefore eligible for the benefits of minority businesses in contracts. And so, I mean, I just use that example as an analogy, not a perfect analogy, but I'm sure there are many systems and laws in place where if we don't, both in the private sector, in the community sector, nonprofit sector, but also in the government sector, are not actually tracking the data, then there's I'm sure there's resources and laws that are not being fully utilized that might even already be on the books, let alone, I'm sure it would identify new laws and new things that need to be created.
Thanks, Cliff. This is Jamelia again. So all these remarks are really helpful. I just want to surface a few things for our conversation. So Cliff, you mentioned the lack of data and analysis, right? It compromises our ability to identify needs for people with disabilities, particularly multiply marginalized, disabled people of color, low-income disabled people, and address their needs, right? So that's a key thing. Eric, you also talked a little bit about some of the challenges incarcerated people had in getting their stories heard, being heard by the facility, being treated as full human beings. We might not see that necessarily in our policy discussions as a data problem, but if we think about it, how many of us have experienced harms and are attempting to get the state to act? And in order to get the state to act, we need to show data, right? One story never seems to be enough sometimes for the state to move. I think back to some of my times doing reporting as a law student, and we'd want to advocate for our clients who were disabled in solitary confinement. I would tell one important story and try to get the prison official and facility to change. And they would say, well, how often is this particular harm happening, right? So one story doesn't tend to be enough. And then Amber, as you mentioned, it is appalling to think about the lack of data, right? Whether it's with respect to diversion, incarceration, and we'll talk about recidivism in a little bit. So I want to kind of use those remarks and my summary of them to go to our next question. So you've all talked about some of these challenges, but let's sort of dive a little deeper, right? So what are some of the challenges in collecting the data? We can speak to the definitional problems that you lifted, Amber, the political will. We can talk to the lack of understanding. But as you all think about this from your own vantage point, what are some of the challenges in collecting data? And then if I can push you to think of how can we overcome this? How can we work to overcome this collectively? Let's start in reverse order. Hopefully that's okay with you, Cliff. If you could get us started.
Sounds good. Well, I'll say two things on this. One, I'll speak from personal experience. So, I am a lawyer by trade, and I was the lead attorney on all of the cases when we opened the legal center. Of course, I was the only attorney and only staff member when we began. We now have 70 staff, and we're going to keep growing. And as the organization got larger, and I started to realize, and I know this sounds kind of naive and kind of silly, but I kind of realized, I started an organization. I kind of came into it with a service mentality, a sense of calling and wanting to help kids in the correctional system. well, that's a bad word for it. The injustice system that's criminal is what I like to call it. But the as the organization grew, I started to realize that as a lawyer, I was not trained in how to run an organization. And I make that analogy because the criminal justice system is led predominantly by lawyers and law enforcement. You usually have a law enforcement background, you're a judge, you're a state's attorney, you're a public defender, you're a prison guard, whatever, some criminal justice background in probation, parole. But none of those disciplines teach you how to actually manage and run an organization. So I actually went back and got my MBA because you start to realize that in order to operate healthy, you have to have internal infrastructure to manage, administer, and operate and understand finance and financial analysis. But all of that runs, quite frankly, on and I know this sounds, I've had to come to terms with this, but I think it's actually a very loving, responsible thing to do, but that comes to numbers. And if you're not actually building processes to understand the data, which is quantifiable data that can be both quantitative and qualitative, then you don't know who you're serving, what they need, and whether you're doing what you think you're doing. You think you're doing it from some anecdotal evidence, from things of that nature. But if you want to try to move the needle in somewhere and you say this strategy is going to accomplish 10% reduction in recidivism, I'm just making that up. Well, if you're not tracking the outcomes of it, then you don't know if it's happening. And I make that analogy to the criminal justice system because at every step, I mean, look at police, just take a look at police. If they just had a process in place where they would be collecting and publishing transparently their data in an undefensive way, but in a collaborative, the community deserves to know, and we deserve to understand how and why they're doing what they're doing and what outcomes they're expecting, and then whether or not those strategies are actually yielding those outcomes. And without data, there's no way of knowing. So I think I was going to say two things. I think I kind of blended them into one statement, which is lawyers and law enforcement generally don't have this skill set. That makes the criminal justice system, I think, when it comes to data transparency and analysis, I think it's a big reason why there really isn't any. We weren't trained to think this way. We didn't. I know a lot of lawyers, even in management, that don't think of this, and of course law enforcement as well. They get just promoted up the ranks from a patrol officer, detective, and then one day you're the superintendent, despite you've not really had any management operations training, and there's no value of data-driven decision making, et cetera. So I'll land the plane there and pass it off to whoever you'd like to send it to next.
Thanks, Cliff. Eric, what do you think?
He's on mute.
Oh, Eric, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I do that just in case there's no background noise while it's the other person's talking. I forget. Like Cliff said, he hit the nail on the head when it comes to the legal. Being that he's an expert on that in his arena is the legal area. For me, it's more on the internalized, getting the data from internally, being that I was an inmate and I had to actually go through the struggles of getting the help that I needed, whether it was medical, mental, or even for my daily needs. I had to do all that on my own because the counselors and the COs and even the warden didn't want to hear it. They weren't even trying to hear it. They would just brush it off. So I had to get everything done. I think at that level, we could start, if we could start collecting data internally from the prison, maybe even the disabled inmates themselves before they even leave, to get that kind of data, let that show that they're actually going through it at that moment, because it's not. If we could help, the reentry program would be a lot easier if it started within the prison system. If we were helping these people, get their lives together before they came out, it would be a lot easier for them not to fall back in there. You know, if you're coming out to your IDs taken care of and you're disabled and you've got Social Security or something coming to you, if you can have that taken care of before you come out and they don't throw you into a home, or if you're lucky to a family's relative's home or something, you could get your own. I mean, it would be a lot of help to be able to just start from there instead of coming out and wasting a year or two out here doing it.
Thank you, Eric.
So as far as the data, if we could collect, I don't know how we would be able to do it, but if we could do it that way, that would be a great help to collect data that way itself.
So Amber?
So this is Amber speaking. Listening to Cliff and Eric, but which, by the way, hello guys, I'm really pleased to see you on here. Hey there. Listening to them, you know, if you're thinking about frontline community work, one of the biggest problems is that a lot of communities don't have the words to talk about disability. Then, you know, there are communities that are not going to talk about disability as a thing, and they may call it something very different. There are a lot of people with disabilities that are not taught to be able to talk about it. And so I think that that is part of the difficulty in collecting information from people that you would want for a demographic sense. But I mean, it's not just demographics we need to understand. It is what I think, going back to what Eric was saying, you need to know what people's functional needs are. And, you know, that is very important for diversion, reentry, and making it through incarceration. And I will say this too, you know, the criminal system, from the point of arrest to when you finish parole or probation, is it's sort of like every time you go through another step, you have to say it all over again. You know, the first time you're arrested, then when you talk to your public defender, if you get one, going through the court, getting booked in the jail, you know, dealing with probation. If you end up going to prison, then you have to talk to it about it to them there. Then you have to go through parole. And every single time, the part of the harm that is done to disabled people in the system is having to explain it again and again and again to people who do not understand what you're talking about, or who are very dismissive of your needs, or just think that maybe they're not real, that you might just be making it up. So that is part of the damage that's done. And I do want to explain a little bit more about disability data collection that I think is important for this conversation. One is that, you know, there have been various kinds of disability data collected over the years, whether that's medical diagnosis or demographic information. But the American Community Survey has an agreed upon set of 6 questions that they use in census taking or in other federal level disability demographic work. And I'm going to read those questions to you. And I want you to think very carefully about what is and is not being said. Okay, so question number 1, are you deaf or do you have serious difficulty hearing? Question number 2, are you blind or do you have serious difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses? Number 3, because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition, do you have serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions? Question number 4, do you have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs? Question number 5, do you have difficulty dressing or bathing? Question number 6, because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition, do you have difficulty doing errands alone, such as visiting a doctor's office or shopping? That's a very interesting set of questions. None of them are, do you have a disability? None of them are you neurodivergent? None of them are, do you have a chronic illness that requires significant amounts of time to manage? There's a lot of missing information in those established federal 6 questions. So of course, what is being used officially doesn't grasp our needs. And of course, like, let's think about what Cliff said about lawyers and people in the system not being trained. Lawyers and community organizations are not trained to think about those questions. They don't know to ask those questions, okay? The other thing I want to point out is that there is a force that is important in changing this dynamic that we have here. And that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of groups rely on donations and grants, right? I mean, we have the nonprofit industrial complex. I'm just going to say it, there it is, okay? But grant makers don't know how to require that their grantees give this information or build the capacity to do it. Fortunately, these days, there's a group called Disability in Philanthropy. It's a great group. You can go to their website, Disability in Philanthropy, but they offer a lot of resources for grant makers and really for grantees to understand how to address disability needs within the grant making that happens and how to address disability needs in the grants that you implement, okay? But the last thing I want to say about why it's so hard to collect disability data is because so many of us are hidden, right? We are hidden within mass incarceration. We are hidden within institutions. We are hidden within when, Eric talked about, what if we have to like double up with somebody at their house and everything? You don't have a place to stay and you're couch surfing and everything. We are hidden because we couch surf. We are hidden because we don't understand your questions when you ask us. We are hidden because we don't have enough money to do any damn thing. We're not going to just show up when you're ready to collect some data. So there has to be a very proactive effort and a disability competent way to find out more from people. There's a lot of work to do. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Amber. This is Jamelia again. So, a couple really important, themes to surface. It's not only that there's a lack of data collection, but there are a lack of practices around collecting disability-related information and data, ways of centering people and people with disabilities and their voices often are left out of those processes. In many ways, it goes back to your first question, Amber, who has the power over this? So the people that have the power over data collection are not the most informed as to how to collect this data. And that can hide problems in plain sight, right? So hidden from this vantage point of the state, not from obviously the people and communities experiencing these forms of violence. A couple examples, we talked about the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the DOJ's, I would think it should be an annual survey, but the data on people with disabilities in prisons, jails, immigration detention facilities. I think it also includes tribal detention facilities as well. That data is updated probably every 5 to 6 years. It's not annually. We also can think about the problem of police violence. To me, as someone that studies policing and police violence, is so it's distressing to think that the best source on police killings comes from the Washington Post, right? A public media outlet, not from the federal government. When we look at that data, we can see it broken down by race and disability. But in the Washington Post data, what we see is a primary focus on psychiatric disabilities, broadly defined. So physical disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities are not included in that. There's also the nebulous appeared to be in mental distress category. That's not quite precise. But if we even look at those numbers, we can obviously see and surface that people with disabilities are 16 times more likely to be killed in encounters with law enforcement. So again, it's just an example to surface the issue that if we don't collect the data in ways that surface all of the diversity of experiences of disability within our community, we will miss these forms of state violence and these experiences. All right, so I want to now shift to talk about specifically recidivism. I'm going to ask you all to speak to how your work aims to reduce recidivism. As a professor, I do want to make a couple points. So when I saw that I was going to be moderating the panel on data and recidivism, my first reaction was, we have to, sort of trouble this idea of recidivism. I guess to maybe say it more specifically, when we think about recidivism, we're thinking about the commission of another offense after serving a criminal conviction. And that can include, I mean, usually that's how it's sort of broadly framed, but we know that people are wrongfully arrested all the time. And so in some senses, a wrongful arrest can show up in a recidivism data sheet. And so there are scholars that are challenging that. We can also think about recidivism not relating to what we would think of as crimes where there's a physical harm inflicted, but crimes relating to more like a violation of kind of a technical violation, if you will, of a condition of parole or probation, right? So that could also feature in certain accounts and studies in recidivism. So when you all sort of think about your own work, how does your work aim to reduce recidivism? And I think it would be helpful if you all could speak about how you think about recidivism, how to define it. How do you think about it in your own work? Of course, thinking about people with disabilities primarily. Okay, so I'll let whoever wants to take that to start us off. Cliff is smiling, so I'm going to violate my rule and choose you.
All right, sounds good. Well, first of all, thank you for starting off with recognizing the word recidivism. I don't like it myself. We really use the language of decreasing involvement with the criminal justice system. It's, I don't laugh because I don't actually think it's funny, but like that's a sort of a broad thing to say, but it is really, we work primarily in communities that are over policed, over prosecuted, over incarcerated, over criminalized. And that is, I think, far more of a problem on our society than it is the individuals within the system. Far, far more. It's an indictment on the system itself. It's an indictment on the equity of our social, political, economic opportunities, or the lack of equity, I should say. And so we have, I'm sorry, a phone call came in as we were talking. I sent it to voicemail. Hopefully it didn't mess anything up. So we are really trying to measure recidivism by how well are we disentangling someone from all arms of the criminal justice system, and at the same time connecting them to community, to supports, to schools, jobs, substance abuse, whatever interventions needed, particularly when it comes to the work we primarily do with the disability. And I will say, I've learned a tremendous amount from Amber. I've just met her even in the last, I feel like 3 or 4 months. And every time I'm on a call with her, I feel like I have learned new things. So Amber, we need to spend more time together. My experience in this would be primarily limited to what I've learned through individualized education plans, mostly school-based children who have learning or behavioral challenges that have, by law, there are certain things our public school system is supposed to accommodate, and that is not happening at large volume. And so for us, one part of disentangling our young people from the criminal justice system is ensuring that their individualized education needs are being met, and that there's a level of advocacy of that within the criminal justice system, that judges and state's attorneys, probation officers, parole officers, prison guards, they all need to understand that, whether they're in their care because they're in prison or because they're advocating for a punishment or some sentence or a violation of probation or violation of parole. If they have no idea what perhaps individualized educational needs they have, I mean, the list that Amber just read, if they don't know that they can't see well or hear well, or all the questions, then you've got, or you have social, emotional, or physical disabilities that prevent you from concentrating and following a line of questions. I mean, how many times have you seen that be abused by a judge or a probation officer or a parole officer because they assume things, they get frustrated and angry, and they don't even really know what's happening. And so, you know, if we're gonna be working toward helping people thrive and succeed in whatever life goals they have, and get them disentangled from the criminal justice system, understanding those needs and meeting them is critical. And so so when we do our defense, we call it holistic community-based defense. And that means, you know, out of the 70 staff, I only have 13 lawyers. We have very social service oriented. We have case managers, social workers, people with, you know, MSWs, LCSWs, LCPCs. We might hire a clinician or two. We do partner with mental health providing organizations. We have housing, workforce development, substance abuse, all the different varying needs that people have, and then individualized education plans. We do have had close partnerships with Equip for Equality for many years. They do great work in this realm. And so for us, it is heavy investment in addressing the underlying contributors to justice involvement in the first place and alleviating those stressors so that primarily for us young people can go on, can have those needs met and become, you know, valued, successful, you know, members of our society.
Thank you.
This is Amber. Do you want to go first, Eric, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I'll go. That way you can finish up.
Okay.
Well, this is Eric again. So, you know, to pick up where Cliff left off, I mean, where the point he brought up is, I think, the most vital one. If we get them when they're young, we can eliminate the latter part of reentry of anything. You know, if we're stopping it from the get, which is ideal, because I mean, as he was talking, I was thinking back at my childhood, and I remember growing up, and I grew up in the neighborhood where it was, I mean, I grew up in back of the yards, I grew up in a little village, even back in the day when it was bad. We had rec centers, we had community centers we could go to, and there was counselors there to, you know, help us get into hobbies, whether it was sports, whether it was wood shop, whatever it was. There was, you know, boxing. I mean, there was options for us not to even start down the wrong path back then. They don't exist anymore. I don't see that anywhere in any of these neighborhoods at all. I mean, all of that is non-existent. And if we could get, like he said, if we could get the resources there at the beginning, that would be the start. Because from my point of view of the reentry, it was, you know, getting you know, assimilated to the community. Like we're talking about, you know, growing up, it was we called recidivism a revolving door. Growing up in the hood, we were like, once you go into the county, once you come out, it's just going to be a revolving door. So we were kind of like brought up to believe that no matter what, you're set up to fail. Once you're in the criminal system, you're set up to fail. And once I still got into the system, I saw how easy it was to you know, to fall into that setup, that mindset. So, I mean, to continue, like he said, a lot of these kids aren't even getting diagnosed with ADHD or learning disabilities, can't read. And a lot of these adults that are in the prison system coming out are the same way. A lot of them are illiterate. They don't, you know, they have ADHD, they haven't been diagnosed. And they're going to come out and continue to do the same thing, and just, it's a revolving door. It's just, you know, like Cliff said, we got to do something from the get to get them to not be there. And then once they're already in that system, we got to, you know, what we're doing on our part as far as access living. I'm not going to speak for Amber's, because, you know, it's the organization is broader than what I'm focusing on for my part of help. I want to be able to help, you know, keep them, you know, once they come out and get back out of prison, to be able to land jobs, to make it easier for them to get jobs, to get their lives, you know, together at a faster pace, so they don't have to linger out here and, you know, turn to the alternatives and end up back in prison. If we could get people, you know, coming out the door running instead of stagnant, I'm guaranteed, I promise that if we could get that data out there and we could get the resources for that, we would see a decline in the revolving door of people coming in and out of the system like that.
This is Amber, and also I'll be the last speaker on that one. So I think that everything that Cliff and Eric said was, of course, super important. In terms of addressing recidivism, and I agree with Cliff that that word really makes it sound like it is the fault of the person who was impacted and not necessarily the result of the system doing a bad job. You know, so I would agree with the fact that that word stinks. But basically, we're describing the process, right, where somebody is incarcerated, they come out, and then they go back in, right? Okay. But there are some very specific reasons why disabled people tend to have that happen to them a lot. And so in the work that I do at Access Living, or the work that my team does at Access Living, because as a director, I think I'm a little bit more of sort of a coach person, because we have fabulous staff that are working in this area all the time. But I can say for sure that, you know, we see opportunities to speak up. So for example, Cook County, the Cook County courts were rolling out an automated reminder system for people to show up for court dates. And, you know, this is great because, you know, if you're a person with a disability who needs reminders, these phone call reminders are a plus. Those are good. That will help. Might not stop everything, but it would help. But the other thing is I asked about whether or not they had a text version of that. And at the time, they were like, we're just trying the system out. We don't know about text. And I'm like, you should have been doing text and phones like at once from the get-go, people. I mean, that's what disability inclusion looks like. You shouldn't assume that some other group is going to take care of the disabled people for you, you know? So anyway, so an opportunity to speak out about, look, you need to have the design right from the get-go tends to be the kind of work that I do. And, you know, another example is one thing that is a significant barrier for returning people is if you have a background and you're seeking housing, right? And the landlords will discriminate against you and, you know, they won't hear you out, or, you know, like there's conditions of your release that prevent you from living in certain areas, right? So it's all that. So we at Access Living have worked really hard to, you know, help people find opportunities for housing that are accessible for them. And accessible housing isn't just, you know, ramps and, you know, bathrooms and all that stuff. Accessible means whatever works for you so you're safe and it's home. That's accessible, okay? So we do a lot of work on that, but when the Just Housing Ordinance came up, Access Living was a very strong supporter of that, because giving people a fair shot to explain, you know, their life story during the rental application process. I mean, what is more common sense than that, right? But I guess there are some racist folks out there that wouldn't agree. But I'm just saying, it seems like a fair and the human thing to do. So we've been a big supporter of that. And, you know, we don't have to be leading every darn thing. There are a lot of people who are doing great work, and if there are ways Access Living can support, then we do that work. We do the support work. One other thing I just want to say about reducing recidivism, two things. One is there are quite a lot of people who are in and out of the system repeatedly because of a lot of complicated disability reasons. They just cannot sustain housing. They cannot manage money. You know, there's a lot of reasons why that might be. I think that there are efforts that are starting to address that, but they still need to be disability competent. They still need to bake in accessibility and meeting access needs. That's the thing. Then finally, this afternoon, you will be hearing more about alternatives to police response, because one of the best ways to keep people out of the system is to get the cops out of it, right? So, and I will leave it to that panel to share more, but I'm looking forward to that too.
Thank you, Amber. This is Jamelia again. So, you know, and just listening to all three of you respond, I noted some important efforts to reframe the way we think about data and recidivism. So Cliff, you know, talking about your organization and how you pose the question, like, how well are we disentangling someone from the criminal legal system? Eric, you talked about recidivism as a revolving door. And Amber, when you talked about some of the solutions or moving forward from some of these deficiencies, you talked about designing things right from the get-go, right? That's a part of our efforts here. So I want to ask you all one more question. I'll also give you all as the audience notice that we would love to hear from you. So if there are any questions, whether you are online or in person, if you're online, we can get a mic to you, or you can come to the front and ask a question. If you are on, or in person, I guess I should have said, if you're online, post it in the chat, I'll read it out loud. All right, so for our panelists, we talked about the gaps in data when we first started this conversation. I just wanted to close with this final question. So we're here in a conference about accessible public safety. We've talked about a few of these things, but just maybe to pinpoint a few more. How does data collection promote the goals of public safety? And if you feel like you want to reiterate something that you said earlier, that's fine. But I want you all to also think about, in responding to this question, what do we need to educate the public? And that's kind of why I started with the reframing and the work that you all are doing and how you're thinking through these issues, because I think it could be so beneficial into how we think about, public safety and accessible public safety. The panelists earlier today talked about community safety as opposed to public safety, because public safety in so many ways has become punitive and carceral and exclusive. So again, how does data collection promote the goals of public safety? And then if when answering your question, you could think about, like, how do we better educate the public to think about accessible public safety? All right. Thank you. I think in a way, just to tie your remarks to where I'm thinking and what our panels have shared, it's sort of, if we're not reactive, then we are able to kind of reframe on the front end, right? And so in many ways, we can think through some of these like broader issues as an organizing effort, or, I don't want to talk about organizing. This is your expertise, Amber, but as a way of getting ahead of these conversations. Thank you for speaking up as someone with direct experience. Any reactions to any of these sort of comments and questions that have been posed? And then I'm going to go to another question here in the audience, and we have one question online.
Okay, so this is Amber. I think I can respond to sort of the whole thing here. Earlier when Dr. Cartman was talking about how important it is that people have the chance to think well of themselves. And Esther, as you mentioned, to know that you are not fallen from God's grace, that you are in fact doing great, right there, right? And one thing that, so this might sound a little bit weird, but I think that idea can also apply to data. There is data that drags you down and data that lifts you up. Think about it that way, right? So there's some of the data that might feel like it can drag you down is in the handbook for this particular event, where it says 43% of people with disabilities are arrested by the age of 28. And that's 55% of Black people with disabilities are arrested by the age of 28. When you go to Black men, that's something like 65%. Okay, so that's data that's going to drag you down. You know what we're not counting? We're not counting all of the ways that communities are fighting to help and support people to live their best life. We're not counting that. We're not counting that disability data. We're not saying we're putting X amount of dollars into supporting our disability communities. We're not running, programs that say this number of people with disabilities are now empowered and will have greater impact in their communities. We're not collecting that information. So you really want to think about data that drags you down, data that lifts you up. And maybe we need a lot more lift up data in the work that we're trying to do. So that kind of combines both what Jamelia said and what our audience members said, but Eric and Cliff, feel free to weigh in.
Well, I'd actually like to build off something you just said, Amber, because public safety sometimes even is a buzzword like recidivism that I don't even like the framing of it. that is not a, just to be clear, I want to be very clear. This is not a commentary on this panel. The organizers, LCLC is a co-sponsor of this event. So I think public safety is a very legitimate title for this. But I'm sharing this in the context of the public at large doesn't understand. I mean, I would say the vast majority would not even fathom the idea that there are systemic injustices, there are systemic reasons, there are societal, economic, social, political reasons for the statement that I think each of us have shared in different ways, that the involvement within the criminal justice system, the statistics that Amber just shared, which are staggering. 48% of disabled people be arrested, and then higher as it gets into people of color, and then men of color. Those are really staggering statistics. And I don't think people really understand that. And so one of the things that I always say on this issue is, once you really, data is important, but also has to have a qualitative element to it. And when you get to know the young people we've served at LCLC, which has been predominantly North Lawndale, Garfield Park, Austin, Little Village, and now on the south side in Englewood. So predominantly Black and Latino, actually not predominantly, 100% Black and Latino. You see our people from an empowerment, what the word is, they have capabilities, they have talents, they are remarkable young people. And when you learn that an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old went out to the block to sell drugs to help their mother with rent, their sisters with food and spending money, and they didn't have a bed to sleep on, and they're buying mattresses for themselves and their family members for the first time, that is not a criminal. I don't care if they're selling drugs. I don't care if they're carrying a weapon while selling drugs. That is not a criminal. That is actually, I would put in the category more of an entrepreneur, somebody who is making things happen for their family, who is providing, taking responsibility. Now, granted, I'm not saying that this is a good desired outcome. I don't think anybody would want 8 to 13-year-olds needing to go to the streets, to the block, to sell drugs, to provide. But shame on us for criminalizing that. That's bananas. That is absolutely bananas. And so when we talk about public safety, like the word recidivism, there's a lot of, and this is just something that's socially at large, personal responsibility and accountability. I'm not saying there isn't some of that, but those same young people I've seen start businesses. I've seen apply those skill sets and be successful in other fields. Once their needs are identified and they are met, whether it's disability related, whether it's housing related, whether it's poverty, job, substance abuse, whatever it is, human growth and honoring the dignity and value of human beings is the best way to create a more safe society. This punitive, laws hold people accountable and punishments it create fear that deter crime, I think is really a very ill way of thinking, because a whole person is and a supported person. None of us make it alone. That's not a thing. There's no real pull it up by your bootstraps. If you believe you've done that, you probably, maybe you got to reassess your life and realize there's a lot of people helping you, even if you've come from meager beginnings. It takes a village, it takes a community. We all need one another. So I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling now, but I do think that we need to shift that narrative in a major way and start to talk about accountability in the systems that social, political, and economic, and the criminal justice system that are really the ones driving these results more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Eric, did you want to add anything? Thank you, Cliff.
it's amazing that Cliff's even bringing all that up because again, uh, I I was that 13-year-old, out there gangbanging and selling drugs to make ends meet because I got tired of the neighbors bringing us food because we didn't have enough. And it's true. You don't. I didn't do it to be a criminal. I did it to survive. And if it wasn't like he said, if it wasn't for the people that were there for me to pick myself up and be encouragements and positive, after I've already been through everything, even into my 20s and stuff, if I wouldn't be the person I am today, because if you would have, this was 30 years ago, 30 something years ago, if you would have looked back at who I was before, I used to rob and steal, and I was a menace to society. And you would have been like, he's an animal, lock him away, but deep down inside, everybody has hope for themselves. And I love that Cliff and everybody on this panel, we're reaching out to help instead of, because I'm a living example. If like you said, if you find their needs and you reach those needs and you meet those needs, a person is gonna thrive. They're gonna blossom into the person they should be instead of the person that they became because of society, unfortunately. But I mean, it's there, and we do need this data so we can start. Then it's essential. Start at the beginning. If we keep going back, I keep going back to Cliff because it is. If we start these children off at the beginning and get them on a path, we're gonna eliminate all this other revolving door, you know, nonsense that we keep going through in society.
Thank you, Eric. So we have about a little under 5 minutes. I want to go to our last question here in the audience. Thank you, TJ. I've been asked to summarize the question because our online participants cannot hear it. So just to summarize, TJ Gordon from UIC is asking about identification and data collection. How do we respect the preferences of people to identify themselves with their language choices, whether it's in some examples, Black versus African-American, people with disabilities versus disabled people, or perhaps the use of maybe outdated terms. How do we reconcile that when we think about data collection?
This is Amber. Hi, TJ. Hey there. I do not know. And I've been asking myself that question this morning because I thought somebody's going to say, that there are all these words that people prefer to call themselves. And then we have to sit down and fill out forms and check boxes on stuff that's sort of like, make us feel kind of funny. I mean, I'll be frank, when I sit down and fill out a demographic form and I see the word Caucasian, I'm like, what are you talking about? The Caucasians is in the middle of, like Azerbaijan and Georgia, and that's not where I'm from. I'm not Caucasian. I'm white, but not Caucasian, and so it definitely makes me feel like, am I just participating in some racist system here if I'm Caucasian? What the heck, So yeah, it's not what I call myself. And then you have this messaging from the census, right? Be counted, be counted. Otherwise you're going to lose, legislative representation or all that stuff, right? And it's like, what kind of choice is that? And I don't have a good answer, but it is a challenge. So that's what I would say in response. I hear you, TJ. Well.
All right, we are at time. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Really grateful to you all.